So it is the same day of the week. Mary's gone to the tomb. The disciples have gone. Mary has seen Jesus, but as of yet, it is clear that the male disciples have not. And here's what happens when it does. We're reading in verses 19 through 31 in John chapter 20. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the religious leadership, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand at his side, I will not believe." A week later, Jesus' disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which were not written in this book. But these were written so that you might come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I love that passage. I love Thomas's doubting. It sounds a little bit like a good questioning Presbyterian. So we can see it for ourselves. But there's an interesting progression in that passage if you're listening carefully. The first day of the week, the disciples are in the room with the door closed and locked because they are afraid. But then they see. They get the message of peace and do not fear. Jesus doesn't say do not fear, but he says peace be with you. You cannot have peace in your soul and deep fear, or at least act out of fear. So the next time Jesus shows up, notice that the door's only shut. And there's no evidence of fear at work. I want to talk a little bit about fear, but I'm going to do it by way of talking about some things going on in our own day and time. Some of you know this, that on June 16th through June 23rd, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church is meeting here in St. Louis. It was 30 years ago, the last time it happened. And it provides us an opportunity to see the diversity within the Presbyterian Church, the many things that are part of it. And our responsibility as members of this presbytery is to offer some hospitality to the Presbyterians who are coming all across the country, the ecumenical guests from around the world, and all of the other folks that will come and be part of this gathering. The good news is we don't have to sit in a committee meeting. We don't have to do the work of the General Assembly. That's what the commissioners are here for. We give thanks for their work, and they will be worked. By the time the week is over, they'll need another week to sleep. Those who've been commissioners know of what I speak. Notice they're shaking their head and saying amen. But we do have have a responsibility. If you're able, and I'll talk more about this to come, and I'll explain why this makes sense in a minute. If you're able to give an hour of time during that entire week, you get a free pass to all the worship services and all the events, the tours, everything. And I think it's important that we get involved because of some conversations I've had recently with people who I went to seminary with who've asked about coming to St. Louis. So as I said, our responsibility is to be hospitality to those folks who are coming, and also a little bit of teacher. So yesterday, I have been designated by the session to be the point person for Westminster, for now. And I had to go to a training yesterday. And it was kind of exciting to see the videos and to hear what was going on, but something happened when I went to one of the tables. The way they had it set up is you went around to different tables, and each one of those volunteers helped us think about ways we could recruit more people. You'll laugh when one of them says, maybe you just bring 50 people from your church on one day. I said, I don't think that's going to happen, but I know people will come. But then I went to one table, and the person was talking about parking downtown and how to get to the convention center. I said, yes, I live in the city, I have churches in the city. But then that person, he went on to say something else that didn't sit well with me. I want to thank him, but I also wished I had had more time at will the next time we talked to challenge him on something he said. He said, when you go downtown, you don't have to worry about it. They're not going to shoot you. He said, and I'll say it again, don't worry about going downtown. You can tell your people, they're not going to shoot you. What I wished I said was, no, you're right, they're not. You're white, and you're not holding a sandwich or a cell phone or a shower head, so they won't shoot you. That's what you meant, right? But I didn't. I was so taken back, I know we shouldn't be surprised by this point, but I was so taken back by this gentleman who lives in far West County. I was surprised by his ignorance that all I could say was, I live in the city. Our church is in the city. We know exactly what it's like. Thanks. Probably with a little bit more edge to it than that. I have his name, I'll be following up. And I'll follow up in love, because no one hears those kinds of challenges well. Especially when you're angry as I was in those moments. And I'm thankful because I know that I've done dumb stuff like that in my own life. And I'm thankful for the people who have come and said, hey, you need to know how this came across. So I think that's our call when that happens. But this isn't the first time. A couple weeks ago, I got a message from a seminary friend who lives in rural America and wrote to me and said, I'd love to come to the General Assembly, but can you tell me if it's really safe? This might have been one of the same people when we were in Atlanta who complained about their apartment getting broken into because, well, they didn't lock their front door in Atlanta. But the perception of our city, the white, suburban, rural fear is real, and it's not just about St. Louis, and it isn't just about scared white Presbyterians. It is part of an American problem. There's a lot of ways to talk about this, but I want to talk about it through a couple of lenses. This one is over 45 years ago, not much more than that. Sorry, that was a reference to another story I'm not sharing. Time-wise, you'll be thankful. When the United States military base in Pearl Harbor was attacked, the president got up and said, you should be really fearful of all Japanese people, and we should attack them in the streets. Right? What he actually said was, we have nothing to fear, but fear itself. Now that didn't keep him from organizing the concentration camps for the Japanese Americans all across the West Coast for the safety of the country. But oddly enough, he did not seek to use that opportunity to whip up fear amongst the population. At least directly from himself, others were doing it well on his behalf. The thing we know is that fear is a really powerful tool and a weapon. Did some looking this week and found some articles In 2016, Time magazine ran an article entitled, "Why Americans Are More Afraid Than They Used to Be." And in that article, what's fascinating, the author says, part of what I find interesting about this is that overall, most Americans live in what is arguably the safest time and place in human history. And yet fear levels are high. In fact, higher than they've been in a long time. For one thing, fear doesn't exist in a vacuum. Larger cultural forces have a way of influencing people in how we respond to questions. Peter Stearns, who's author of American Fear, The Causes and Consequences of High Anxiety, wrote this, that if you think that society around you expects courage, you may be scared to death, but you're not going to tell the pollster. But currently, he says, fear has become in some ways slightly less fashionable. So maybe people are even exaggerating a little bit. Hard to tell. I also take one of the periodicals that I read regularly is the Christian Science Monitor. An article from back in September, and I pulled it back then because I found it so fascinating, was this idea that we have in this country a paradox of fear. What we know for a fact is that crime is at its lowest levels in generations. And more Americans feel less safe than they've ever felt. And what's interesting is that there is a perception in rural America that we live in a war zone if you live in a city. Now here's the reality about that. Per capita, rural America is more violent than urban America. And yet that doesn't stop those in power from saying, you should be afraid. Those who seek power, those who seek to maintain it, find fear that is a better weapon than anything else. There are many reasons why there is this rise of fear in our country, and anytime someone says it is one thing, know that they don't know what they're talking about. Every one of those articles talked about a myriad of things that have to contribute to it, but no one could figure out exactly the one thing. That's funny how problems usually turn out not to be one thing. In fact, when someone lays out the one thing that's the problem, you might know that they're not trying to whip up fear. Nothing drives me crazier than getting requests to purchase a product that begin with fear and lead with fear. If you're selling fear, whatever you're selling isn't worth buying. I think we have to be aware, and I think we are on some level, the power of fear and how it permeates our own culture. It is developed entire news networks around fear. It's vital for those of us who know that the tomb was empty to recognize and point out when fear is being used as a motivator. You can rally people to war on unfounded rumors and fears. You can find people stockpiling duct tape one day and blaming immigrants the next. Do you remember duct tape? We were supposed to pack that up and hold on to it because after September 11, they were coming. Fear can help bring a government to its knees. We have the lowest level of illegal immigration in the United States right now. But lo and behold, we're sticking the military on our borders. Fear can bring a government to its knees. Fear can build a powerful religious institution. But usually fear motivates in far more subtle ways. In fact, though, the worst and most insidious fear is that which we internalize. There was a study done recently that talked about the ways in which people voted. The more fearful they were, the more likely they were to vote for one party over another. And what I mean by, though, the internalized fear is the fear that we take from the peddlers of fear and make it our own. It is not fear itself that is the problem, it is acting out of these fears. believe that when we act out in our fear, that is where the trouble becomes real. When we're fearful, we lose the ability to listen to other people, to hear what they're saying, and even to recognize them as a beloved child of God. Fear limits our creativity. A few years ago, I read a book by Deborah Dickerson, been more than a few now, called An American Story. It's her memoir of growing up in St. Louis at the end of the 1960s. It's a powerful look at the realities of race in this city and in our nation and in her experience. But what's been fascinating is the work that she did for a number of years on a blog and an article that she ended up writing for Salon. And the title of it was called The Last Plantation. And in that article, she talked about the power of the mind to internalize the external fears and ultimately end up doing the work for the peddlers of fear for them. We censor ourselves. We step back. We don't say when something's wrong. We let the bullies beat up on somebody because I don't want the bully to pick on me. Unless we're able to move into the direction of our deepest dreams and hopes, recognizing that the tomb was empty, we'll always end up being satisfied fighting over how the furniture is arranged. In other words, there's no systemic change as long as we can remain fearful and get our piece of the pie. You know, when the disciples were up in the room, they already know that the tomb was empty. But they hadn't seen Jesus yet. They closed the door, they locked it, and they were afraid of the religious leaders. They heard the news, but they chose to ignore it, or maybe just couldn't bear to believe that it was possible. It was a willed ignorance on their part. They couldn't trust Mary. The words of a woman were not enough. And for Thomas, right? Not only were the words of Mary and the words of all of the other men not enough, he had to touch Jesus for himself. I wonder if he was alive today, he'd be asking for a certified copy of the resurrection certificate. Before the disciples can believe and be witnesses, they have to deal with their fear first. Their fear is guiding their actions. Their fear is leading their discipleship, which turns out not to be discipleship. And it isn't until they give up the fear that they can say, "We have seen the Lord." Now, deep down in the back of their minds, I know that they still probably had to be a little afraid. They had to worry that somehow they were going to end up on the cross too. What was going to happen? And to lead the way. Which means if we're going to deal with the fear peddlers in our own time, we have to ask ourselves some hard questions to get in touch with who we are. Where are the places of fear in our own lives? What keeps us up at night? What makes us wring our hands? And worse, where are we doing the work of the peddlers of fear for them? The tomb is empty. We proclaim that. We know that death is not the end. And so we're then called to live as free people. One of the most amazing Easter sermons I ever heard was not by an official preacher, but by a former president back in 2016. It was at an Easter breakfast, Easter Monday breakfast. And then President Obama spoke powerfully to the Easter people. He was talking to the church, the ones who would follow Jesus, the ones who claimed the tomb was empty and knew another way to live in the world. And I want to use his words. I did when he first used them. This was part of an Easter sermon, his quote from a sermon a number of years ago, because it was so powerful. When we live in fearful times, when we hear the peddlers of fear, and we know that there are things to be afraid of in our world, in our neighborhoods, and in our lives, but to not be led by them. I want to share his quote. It's a little long, but he speaks better than I do, so I think you can appreciate If Easter means anything, he starts, it is that you don't have to be afraid. We drown out darkness with light, and we heal hatred with love, and we hold on to hope. And we think about all that Jesus suffered and sacrificed on our behalf. Scorned, abandoned, shunned, nail-scarred hands, bearing the injustice of his death and carrying the sins of the world. Because of him, our hope is not misplaced, and we do not have to be afraid. As Christians have said through the years, quote, we are Easter people, and hallelujah is our song. We are Easter people. People of hope and not fear. And now this is not a static hope. This is a living and breathing hope. It's a gift we simply receive, but one we must give to others. A gift to carry through. The disciples had to make some decisions. Would they be led by fear? Would they try to control others with fear? Control with fear is the power of empire. God invites us not to be afraid, but to have peace, and not just to have it, but to share. Notice what Jesus says to the disciples. He first says, in the first time they encounter him, peace be with you. But he doesn't end there. Simply saying, do not be afraid and have peace isn't enough. There's a second half. Just as God sent me, Jesus says, I send you. We're sent. We're called to be peace. We're called to bear peace. We're called not to fear. And then we're called to go. And there's a lot of places we can go and share love and peace and hope. Because we know the tomb is empty. The peddlers of fear and death, they're not going to have the last word.